Here are 5 weird-ass F1 constructor names. Now, F1 constructor names can be a bit unwieldy. You look at something like Aston Martin, Red Bull, Honda, and that's a bit of a mouthful. But when the car looks like this, you can probably guess that this bit is the actual name of the constructor, and an easy rule of thumb is that anything at the end is usually the engine manufacturer, or power unit as they are now called. And anything at the front is usually just the title sponsor. Once you learn these simple rules, you can look at any F1 constructor name and usually know exactly what team we're talking about, right? Right? Well, sometimes you'll look at the standings list of an old F1 season and you find yourself really just scratching your head. What the hell is this anyway? So here are examples of 5 very confusing constructor names throughout F1 history. At number 1, Albilad. Okay, so some of these other guys will always change from year to year. Sauber is now Alfa Romeo, for instance. But you can always trust in Ferrari, McLaren, and Rocket Williams F1 team. Oh, except that they don't have a title sponsor anymore. So Williams, right? Williams has always been Williams. Alright, so Williams is the 3rd oldest constructor, and for the first 2 years they did run under that name. But then between 1978 and 1981, they had a bizarre array of different constructor names. My favorite is Albilad, which I think has to be the cutest constructor name ever. Number 2, Team Lotus and Lotus Renault. Alright, so you might be aware that in Formula 1s we have this really annoying situation where we're about to have 2 F1 teams that have the word Alpha in the title. Alfa Romeo, which is the old Sauber team, and AlphaTauri, which is the former Toro Rosso team. And what used to be the junior team for the Red Bull team for up-and-coming drivers, but now it just seems to be the dumping ground for disgraced Red Bull drivers. And even though these two will invariably be referred to as Alphas, at least there is a spelling difference between them. But there was no such luck in 2011 when there were 2 teams that were called Lotus on the F1 grid. Okay, the first one of these, Team Lotus, had actually debuted the previous year. Owned by Malaysian airline tycoon Tony Fernandes, they raced these green cars that were slow as molasses. Lotus Renault was just the old Renault team, which had last won a championship in 2006. Now, one important reminder is that neither one of these constructors have anything to do with the classic Lotus racing team, which had its heyday in the 1970s and last raced in the early 90s. So you can probably guess that there was some brand dealing going on behind the scenes. So how in the hell did we end up with 2 teams with practically the same name? Tony Fernandes kicked off his team in 2010. He of course was being sponsored by Genie Capital, the company that now owns the Lotus car brand. However, once Genie realized how slow the Lotus team was, in fact it was only faster than the 2 other teams that debuted that season, they then started eyeing up the French Renault team, which was going through some monetary issues at the time, but were still having a pretty decent season. And before all of this happened, the Team Lotus, which Tony Fernandes ran, had already signed a Renault engine deal for 2011. Now, Tony is apparently a very petty man, because when he found out that he was going to lose his Lotus sponsorship, he went and bought the team name of the original Lotus team so that he could run his team under it in 2011. Now, if you were guessing that some words were had between lawyers over this situation, well, you were right. But Tony got away with his massive troll in the end, since the courts decided that Fernandes had acquired the team entry name completely legally. Of course, they did see through his thinly veiled bullshit, and so decreed that Fernandes was allowed to keep the team name until the end of the 2011 season, provided that he would change it for the 2012 season. Which he did, but before we get to that, we have to acknowledge the unfortunate truth that there were indeed 2 teams called Lotus running Renault engines on the grid in 2011. So Fernandes really won out because there was no alternate name for his team. They were just Lotus. In fact, because of this reason, many people just took to calling the second team Lotus Renault, or just Renault in order to tell them apart. It wasn't until the following year that Fernandes' team would debut with the title sponsorship from the Caterham car company, which itself has since gone bankrupt. Number 3, Footwork. Now, if you've ever taken a glance at the Formula 1 entry list from the early part of the 90s, the name Footwork might jump at you as they competed for several seasons. Now that seems like a really weird name for an F1 team, doesn't it? I mean, what is this, some kind of cheap promotion for the live-action Flintstones movie? And because clothes companies actually have a history of running F1 teams, my first instinct was that this was some kind of shoe company, you know, like Fila or Andrea Moda. So I want to take a stab at which well-known F1 constructor actually ran under this name for 5 years in the early 90s. It was Arrows. The Arrows team debuted in the late 70s and then folded in the early 2000s due to monetary problems. And indeed, from 1991 till 1996, they ran under the Footwork name, which was the name of the Japanese company which acquired them during those years. Unsurprisingly, Arrows also ran Japanese motors. And what's really weird about this title change is that even though Footwork was the name used in all of the official entry lists, people still kept referring to the team as Footwork Arrows, or in some cases simply Arrows, meaning that the team identity didn't simply change. Which always makes me raise an eyebrow when people try to claim that BMW and Sauber weren't the same team, even though they clearly were. Speaking of which, number 4, Force India. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit with this one because this isn't technically a name issue, but rather an ownership issue. But if you go and look at the entry list or the Constructors' Championship table for the 2018 season, you will see that there are 2 teams listed called Force India. However, neither team raced at the same time, and in fact, at the point at which the first team just disappears from the tables, the second one appears. So what's the deal with all this? Well, as you probably guessed, in the middle of the 2018 season, the Force India team went bankrupt. And this bankruptcy had the most unfortunate timing for the team. Just before it happened, Force India was actually having a very good season. They were only a few points off Haas, who was in the championship top 5, and they were even beating out McLaren. However, the team had been bleeding money for a good long while, so it wasn't totally unexpected when they suddenly ran out. But the real annoying bit about this is just how well they were doing at that point. So, Lawrence Stroll, father of Lance Stroll, as well as a group of mysterious investors, decided to pull their money and buy Force India in order to allow it to race for the rest of the season and also to get Lawrence's son Lance out of the Williams team that wasn't doing so hot at the time. However, despite the fact that the team names were entirely the same, the drivers were entirely the same, and the grid workers were all the same because the team had shifted ownership in the middle of the season and because it had to be registered in a different country, the FIA forced Force India to forfeit their entire points total. Now, Force India continued to have a really good season after that, scoring a lot of points, but they only ended up 7th in the Constructors' Championship behind McLaren. And the real kick in the teeth in all of this is that if Force India had been allowed to keep the points from the early half of the season, they wouldn't have just beaten McLaren, they would have beaten Haas to be 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Ain't that some shit? And finally, number 5, BMW Sauber Ferrari. Oh boy. This doozy of a team name comes from 2010. Now, carrying on the name of a constructor that technically isn't even part of the sport anymore isn't that unheard of. During its penultimate season, the Manor team was still officially known as Marussia in order to secure the TV revenue money that the team would have gotten from the 2014 season thanks to the late Jules Bianchi. So while Marussia, the car company, didn't have any stakes in the Manor team, they were technically entered under their name. A similar story happened back in 2010 when after the 2009 season, BMW left Formula Ones. Now, BMW had previously been the engine manufacturer for our old friends Williams, but then in a trend that is unfortunately very common in this sport, ended up in a bitter divorce with the team, and so bought out the Sauber team in 2006 and turned it into BMW Sauber. And basically proved that it wasn't their engine's fault that Williams wasn't challenging Ferrari and Renault for the championships. However, after a disappointing 2009 outing, which saw them land 6th in the Constructors' Championships, and probably due to the global economic situation, BMW, alongside Toyota, pulled out of the sport altogether, which was ironic because Toyota happened to be Williams' engine supplier at that time. Now, BMW weren't complete dicks, and so sold the team back to its original founder, Peter Sauber. And although 6th in the Constructors' Championship was pretty low for BMW standards, just as with the case of Marussia and Manor, there was a lot of TV revenue money tied to that position. And because Peter Sauber wasn't exactly swimming in dough at the time, and the FIA needed some assurance that the team was basically the same as the previous year, only now without BMW's backing, the Sauber team was ironically forced to keep BMW in the title. And because they didn't have an engine manufacturer anymore, they of course signed a deal with Ferrari. And the fact that there was no BMW partnership should have been obvious since the car looked considerably different with basically no sponsors at the start of 2010, nor was there any recognizable BMW insignias on it. That's kinda messed up. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm TheHande back again. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.